In March of 1918, a United States Navy vessel carrying 309 people departed the island of Barbados and sailed into the open Atlantic Ocean. It never arrived. No distress signal was ever transmitted. No wreckage was found. No bodies were recovered. No debris. No lifeboats. Nothing. A ship longer than 1.5 football fields, carrying thousands of tons of cargo and hundreds of living human beings, simply ceased to exist. The United States Navy, one of the most powerful naval forces in the world, searched the Atlantic and found nothing. To this day, the USS Cyclops remains the single largest non-combat loss of life in the entire history of the United States Navy. This is not a legend. This is not a myth built around fear or imagination. This is a documented, verified, and deeply investigated case that has puzzled naval historians, engineers, and researchers for over a century. To understand what happened in those final hours, it is necessary to go back to the beginning. Back to a ship that was never built for mystery. A ship that was built for war. The year was 1910. The world was changing faster than governments could manage. Industrial warfare was no longer a distant idea. Nations were building armies, stockpiling weapons, and demanding raw materials on a scale never seen before. Steel was the foundation of modern war. And steel required manganese. Manganese required ships. Large, powerful, relentless ships. The USS Cyclops was commissioned on May 7, 1910, as part of the United States Navy's Proteus-class collier fleet. She was designed as a cargo vessel, specifically built to haul enormous quantities of heavy material across long ocean distances. At approximately 165 meters in length and displacing nearly 19,000 tons when fully loaded, the Cyclops was not a warship in the traditional sense. She carried no heavy guns. She fired no torpedoes. Her weapon was capacity. Her value was in what she could carry and where she could deliver it. For the first years of her service, the Cyclops operated exactly as designed. She moved coal, supplies, and essential materials across Atlantic and Caribbean routes, supporting the operational needs of the U.S. Navy. She was reliable. She was familiar. She was considered one of the fleet's workhorses. But by 1917, the world had changed. The United States had entered World War I. The demand for war materials had reached a point of desperation. Ships like the Cyclops were no longer just supply vessels. They were lifelines. Every ton of material they carried fed the war machine that American soldiers and Allied forces depended on. The USS Cyclops was pulled into that system completely. And with that shift came new pressures, new cargo, and decisions that would ultimately define her fate. She was a ship built for war's demands, and in the end, those demands may have been exactly what destroyed her. By early 1918, the war in Europe had entered its most brutal and desperate phase. The Western Front had been locked in a grinding stalemate for years. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had already died in trenches that stretched across France and Belgium. The Allied forces needed steel for weapons, for tanks, for artillery shells, for the infrastructure of industrial warfare, and to produce steel at wartime scale, they needed one specific material in enormous quantities: manganese ore. Manganese is a hard, brittle metal found deep in the earth. When combined with iron during the steel production process, it removes impurities, strengthens the final product, and makes it suitable for the demands of modern warfare. Without a steady supply of manganese, steel production slows. And when steel production slows, the war effort suffers. Brazil held significant manganese deposits, and the United States had been sourcing the material from South American operations throughout the war. The USS Cyclops was assigned to collect a shipment from the port of Bahia, modern-day Salvador, on the northeastern coast of Brazil. It was a straightforward mission on paper: load the ore, cross the Atlantic, deliver to Baltimore. The kind of assignment the Cyclops had been built for. But what happened at the port of Bahia was not straightforward at all. When the loading process was completed, the Cyclops was carrying approximately 10,800 tons of manganese ore. This number matters. Manganese ore is significantly denser than coal, the material the Cyclops was originally designed to transport. The ship's holds were built for a specific weight distribution. Manganese, by its very nature, concentrates mass in a way that coal does not. It settles heavily, it shifts unpredictably, and it places stress on the hull and internal framework of a vessel in ways that require careful management. Naval engineers who later examined the loading records noted that the Cyclops was operating beyond her recommended safe capacity. She was not simply full, she was overloaded. The waterline sat lower than it should have. Her hull rode deeper in the water, reducing the freeboard, the critical distance between the ocean's surface and the ship's deck edge. In rough seas, a reduced freeboard means waves reach the deck more easily. Water enters spaces it should not. The margin for error disappears. This was the physical condition of the Cyclops when she prepared to leave Brazil. A ship already carrying more weight and was considered safe with her hull submerged deeper than designed, preparing to cross one of the most unpredictable stretches of open ocean in the world. And she was doing it under a commander whose judgment had already drawn attention within the Navy. Captain George Worley had been in command of the Cyclops for years. He was experienced, he knew the ship, he knew the routes. By any measure of technical qualification, he was a capable mariner. But accounts from crew members, naval officers, and official records painted a picture of a man who was difficult, unpredictable, and at times deeply irrational under pressure. Reports from earlier voyages described Worley making unusual decisions without explanation. There were accounts of him behaving erratically toward crew members, issuing confusing orders, and operating in ways that created unease among those serving under him. Some accounts went further, suggesting that Worley's loyalty to the United States had been quietly questioned. He had been born in Germany, and in 1918, with anti-German sentiment at its peak across America. That detail did not go unnoticed by naval investigators later examining the case. None of these concerns, however, resulted in his removal from command before the final voyage. Worley remained in charge. The Cyclops remained loaded beyond safe limits, and the mission proceeded. As the ship pulled away from the Brazilian coast and pointed her bow northward toward the Caribbean, the men aboard had no reason to believe this voyage would be different from any other. The war was the backdrop of everything. Danger was normalized. Discomfort was expected. 309 people settled into the rhythms of a long ocean crossing, unaware that for all of them, this was the last time they would see land they could name. The Atlantic stretched ahead. Baltimore was the destination, and somewhere between that departure and that arrival, something went terribly, completely, and permanently wrong. Part 3. The Last Stop, Barbados, March 4, 1918. The USS Cyclops had a planned route. From Bahia, Brazil, the course was set northward through the Caribbean and up the eastern seaboard of the United States, ending at the port of Baltimore, Maryland. It was a familiar path, a route the ship had traveled before. Under normal circumstances, there was no operational reason to stop. But on March 4, 1918, the Cyclops appeared in the harbor of Bridgetown, Barbados, unscheduled, unannounced, and to this day, never fully explained. An unscheduled port stop for a naval vessel in wartime is not a casual decision. Ships operating under military orders follow designated routes with specific timing. Deviating from that route requires justification. Fuel consumption, mechanical issues, medical emergencies, or direct orders from a superior command, these are the kinds of reasons that produce an unplanned stop. Whatever brought the Cyclops into Barbados that morning, Captain Worley did not provide a detailed explanation in his communications. What is known is what was observed and recorded by port officials and the American consul stationed in Barbados at the time. The Cyclops arrived and requested resupply. She took on additional fuel and provisions. On the surface, the ship appeared operational. No visible structural damage was reported by port observers. No emergency was declared. No formal distress of any kind was communicated to local authorities or naval command. Captain Worley communicated with the American consul during the stop. His report was brief and unremarkable. Everything was normal, he indicated. The ship was in order. The crew was in order. The cargo was in order. He gave no indication of mechanical trouble, no mention of concerns about the vessel's condition, and no suggestion that the voyage ahead presented any unusual challenge. But the consul's own observations told a slightly different story. The American consul in Barbados later reported that he found Worley's behavior during the stop to be somewhat unusual. The captain appeared tense. His communication was not entirely consistent. The consul noted in his report that he had an uncomfortable impression of the visit. Though he could point to nothing specific and alarming enough to warrant intervention or a formal report to naval command at the time, there was also a separate and quietly troubling detail recorded during the Barbados stop. One of the passengers aboard the Cyclops at that point was a man named Lieutenant Commander Alfred Nervig, a U.S. Navy officer traveling as a passenger rather than crew. Nervig later wrote an account of his time aboard the Cyclops during the voyage from Brazil, describing the ship's condition in terms that raised questions about her seaworthiness. He noted that one of the ship's two engines was not functioning correctly. The Cyclops, according to his account, had been operating on a single engine for a portion of the journey. This detail is critical. A vessel of the Cyclops' size and weight, carrying an overloaded cargo of dense manganese ore, required the full mechanical capacity of both engines to maintain safe steering and speed management in open ocean conditions. A single functioning engine reduced her ability to maneuver in heavy weather. It reduced her response time if conditions deteriorated suddenly. It made her, in practical terms, significantly more vulnerable than her outward appearance suggested. Whether Captain Worley reported this engine issue to Naval Command during the Barbados stop remains unclear. If he did, no corrective action was taken. If he did not, it represents a decision of extraordinary consequence. A commander choosing to continue a compromised voyage rather than request assistance or delay departure. On March 4, 1918, the USS Cyclops completed her resupply, cast off from the harbor at Bridgetown, and sailed north into the open Caribbean toward the Atlantic. 309 people were aboard: officers, enlisted sailors, civilian crew members, and passengers. Men with families waiting in American cities, men who had written letters home from Brazil and expected to be back in the United States within days. The harbor at Bridgetown grew smaller behind them. The island of Barbados disappeared beneath the horizon. No one on that dock, no port official, no naval observer, no local resident who watched that ship depart that morning could have known what they were actually witnessing. They were watching the last confirmed sighting of the USS Cyclops. After March 4, 1918, no verified report, no credible sighting, no communication of any kind was ever received from the ship or anyone aboard her. She sailed out of Barbados and into a silence that has never been broken. 309 people. Gone. In 1918, the United States Navy did not have satellites. It did not have radar. It did not have the real-time tracking systems that modern navies rely on to monitor every vessel in their fleet. Communication at sea depended on radio transmission, visual signals, and scheduled reporting. A ship on a routine voyage was expected to arrive at its destination within a calculated window of time. If it did not, the first assumption was always delay, weather, minor mechanical trouble, an unscheduled stop. So when the USS Cyclops failed to arrive in Baltimore within her expected time frame, the Navy did not immediately panic. Ships were late. It happened. The Atlantic in early spring was unpredictable, and wartime logistics were stretched across too many operations for any single vessel to command immediate attention. Days passed. Naval Command waited. Baltimore waited. The families of 309 men waited without knowing there was anything to wait for. No one had told them their husbands, fathers, and sons were overdue. The machinery of wartime information control kept the situation quiet while the Navy monitored for any incoming communication from the Cyclops. None came. A week passed. Then another. The window for a routine delay closed entirely. Even accounting for the worst mechanical breakdown, even accounting for the most severe weather deviation, the Cyclops should have been heard from by now. A ship carrying nearly 11,000 tons of strategic war material, operated by the United States Navy, did not simply go quiet for 2 weeks without explanation. Naval Command began making direct inquiries. Messages were sent to ports along the eastern seaboard. Harbor authorities in Baltimore, Norfolk, and other Atlantic facilities were asked if they had any record of the Cyclops. They had not. Shipping lane observers were contacted. Regional naval stations were put on alert to report any sighting. Nothing came back. The silence was no longer a possibility to be managed. It was a reality to be confronted. The USS Cyclops, carrying 309 people and over 10,000 tons of cargo, had simply stopped existing in the official record of the United States Navy. No distress call had been received on any monitored frequency. No wreckage had been spotted by any passing vessel. No bodies had washed ashore on any coastline. No debris field had been reported anywhere along the expected route between Barbados and Baltimore. For a ship of that size, that silence was not just unusual. It was almost physically impossible to explain. When a large vessel sinks, even rapidly, the ocean produces evidence. Wooden crates float. Life preserver surface. Personal belongings, documents, clothing, fuel residue. These things rise to the surface and drift with the current. They wash onto beaches. They are spotted by other ships. The Atlantic is not a void. It is a body of water crossed by dozens of vessels every week, each one a potential witness to any debris that the sea releases. But the Atlantic released nothing connected to the USS Cyclops. Not a single confirmed piece of wreckage. Not one identifiable object. Not one body. 309 people had boarded that ship. And the ocean had swallowed every trace of them without producing a single piece of evidence that they had ever existed. The Navy had no choice but to accept what the silence was telling them. The USS Cyclops was gone, and they had no idea how, where, or why. The formal search effort began as soon as Naval Command accepted that the Cyclops was not delayed. She was missing. Search vessels were dispatched across the Atlantic shipping lanes between Barbados and the American eastern seaboard. The Navy focused on the most logical route, the path the Cyclops would have taken under normal navigation, heading northwest from Barbados, through the Caribbean approaches, and up toward Baltimore. This corridor was not empty ocean. It was one of the most traveled maritime routes in the western Atlantic, used by commercial and military vessels constantly throughout the war. Search crews scanned the water. They watched the surface for anything that did not belong. Oil slicks, which form when a ship's fuel tanks rupture during a sinking, can persist on the ocean's surface for days. Wooden debris from a ship's interior fittings, furniture, and structural components can float indefinitely. Life rings, emergency equipment, personal belongings. All of these things become visible markers of a disaster site. The search teams found none of it. They extended the search area. They accounted for Atlantic current patterns, calculating where debris might have drifted over the weeks since the Cyclops had last been seen. They expanded northward, southward, and eastward, covering a search zone far larger than the ship's direct route would have required. Still nothing. Naval Command was facing something that had very few precedents in modern maritime history. A vessel of nearly 20,000 tons displacement, one of the largest cargo ships in the Navy's fleet, had disappeared without producing a single recoverable piece of physical evidence. The search effort, already constrained by the demands of an active world war, could not be sustained indefinitely. Resources were needed elsewhere. The war did not pause for missing ships, no matter how large or how many people were aboard. The search was eventually scaled back and then effectively abandoned. The Navy had found nothing because there was nothing findable. Whatever had happened to the Cyclops had happened completely, rapidly, and in a location or manner that the ocean had entirely reclaimed. The official investigation began in earnest, but it was an investigation built almost entirely on absence. There was no wreck to examine, no black box equivalent to recover and analyze, no surviving witnesses to interview, no final transmissions to decode. The investigators were working in a complete vacuum of physical evidence, trying to reconstruct the final hours of a ship from nothing more than departure records, loading documents, and the accounts of people who had seen her in Barbados. What they did have was information, and when they began examining that information carefully, the picture that emerged was deeply troubling, not because it pointed towards something supernatural or inexplicable, but because it pointed towards something entirely preventable. The answers were not in the ocean. They were in the paperwork. Naval engineers assigned to the investigation pulled the loading records from Bahia, Brazil, with careful attention. What they found was a ship that should not have departed in the condition she was in. The USS Cyclops had been loaded with approximately 10,800 tons of manganese ore. This figure alone was a serious concern. The ship's designed cargo capacity for dense, heavy materials was not intended to accommodate that level of concentrated weight. Manganese ore is not like coal. Coal, the material the Cyclops was originally built to transport, is relatively uniform in how it distributes weight across a ship's hold. It settles in a way that maintains a reasonably stable center of gravity. Manganese ore behaves differently. It is significantly denser than coal, meaning the same volume of space in the ship's hold contains far more weight. When manganese is loaded into a vessel, it concentrates mass at the bottom of the hull with an intensity that strains the ship's structural framework. The keel, the ribs, the internal bracing, all of these components bear forces they were not engineered to handle at that level. But the problem was not only the weight, it was what that weight can do when the ship encountered movement. Manganese ore, like many dense granular materials, is subject to cargo shift. When a heavily loaded ship rolls in rough seas, the cargo inside the hold can begin to slide. On a vessel carrying lighter or more uniformly distributed cargo, a degree of shifting can be managed. But when the cargo is this dense, this heavy and loaded beyond the ship's recommended limits, a shift in the center of gravity can become catastrophic within minutes. A ship that rolls to one side and finds that its cargo has moved toward that same side has lost the counterbalancing force it needs to right itself. It continues to roll, and at a certain angle, the physics become irreversible. The investigators also confirmed what Lieutenant Commander Nervik had noted during the voyage from Brazil. One of the Cyclops' two main engines was not functioning properly before the ship departed Barbados. The vessel had been operating with reduced mechanical capacity on a voyage that demanded full operational performance. This mattered enormously from a seamanship perspective. A ship of the Cyclops' size uses both engines not just for forward propulsion, but for the ability to maneuver precisely. In heavy weather, a captain needs full engine power to hold a course, to correct heading, to manage the ship's angle relative to incoming waves. Without one engine, the options available to the crew in an emergency were significantly reduced. The ship would have been slower to respond, harder to control, more vulnerable to being caught broadside by a large wave. Exactly the kind of position that, combined with an overloaded and potentially shifting cargo, could lead to a catastrophic and rapid capsize. The picture assembling itself from the loading records and the technical analysis was not one of mystery. It was one of accumulated risk. A ship beyond safe weight limits carrying a cargo prone to dangerous shifting, running on one engine in the open Atlantic in March. Each of these factors alone was manageable. Together, they created a vessel operating at the very edge of what the ocean would tolerate. And the ocean, as March of 1918 was about to demonstrate, was not in the tolerant condition. The North Atlantic and the Caribbean approaches in March are not gentle waters. March sits at the intersection of late winter and early spring in the Northern Hemisphere, and in maritime terms, that transition produces some of the most volatile and unpredictable weather conditions of the year. Cold air masses moving down from the north collide with warmer, moisture-heavy air rising from the south. The result is rapid storm development, sudden pressure drops, and wave conditions that can escalate from manageable to catastrophic within hours. Historical weather records for the Atlantic region during March 1918 confirm what experienced sailors of that era already knew from instinct. The waters between the Caribbean and the eastern seaboard of the United States were subject to sudden and severe storm events during that period. Exact meteorological data for the precise location of the Cyclops' final route was not comprehensively recorded at the time. Weather monitoring in 1918 was limited compared to modern standards, but the general pattern of the region in that season is well established. Rogue waves, while a concept that was not scientifically formalized until much later in the 20th century, were known to sailors as a real and terrifying hazard. A rogue wave is not simply a large wave. It is an abnormally large wave that forms when multiple wave systems converge in a way that produces a single wall of water dramatically exceeding the surrounding sea state. These waves can reach heights of 20 to 30 meters or more. They form without warning. They have no extended approach that a helmsman can see and respond to. They arrive. For a ship in the condition of the Cyclops, overloaded, running on one engine, riding low in the water with reduced freeboard, a single encounter with a rogue wave or an extreme storm swell could have been decisive. Consider the sequence of events that naval engineers believe may have unfolded. The Cyclops, moving northwest through heavy Atlantic weather, encounters a severe wave event. The ship rolls heavily to one side. The manganese ore, already under stress from the rolling motion of the voyage, begins to shift within the hold. The center of gravity moves. The ship, unable to right itself fully due to the redistributed weight, rolls further. Water begins coming over the deck. The single functioning engine is insufficient to hold the ship's heading against the force of the sea. The roll continues past the point of recovery. In such a scenario, the sinking would not have been gradual. It would not have given the crew time to reach lifeboats, deploy emergency equipment, or transmit a distress signal. A capsize of this nature, once the tipping point was reached, could have taken the ship under in minutes, possibly less. This is why no distress signal was ever received, not because the radio equipment failed before the crisis began, but because the crisis itself unfolded faster than any human response was possible. The radio operator would have had no time. The captain would have had no time. 309 people would have had no time. The ship would have gone from sailing to sinking before anyone aboard could do anything at all. The weather did not leave a record of exactly what it delivered to the Cyclops on that final day, but the physics of what the ship was carrying and the conditions of the ocean she was crossing tell the story clearly enough. In March of 1918, the world was at war, and when a United States Navy vessel disappeared without explanation in wartime, the first question asked by the public, by the press, and by Naval Command itself was the same. Had the Germans done this? German U-boats had been one of the most feared and effective weapons of the First World War. Since the early years of the conflict, German submarine warfare had targeted Allied shipping across the Atlantic with devastating results. Merchant vessels, supply ships, passenger liners. The U-boats had demonstrated a willingness and a capability to sink any vessel that served the Allied cause. The USS Cyclops, carrying strategic war materials and operating under the U.S. Navy flag, was exactly the kind of target that German naval strategy would have considered legitimate. The theory spread quickly. Newspaper coverage of the Cyclops' disappearance, once it became public, leaned heavily on the wartime context. Readers were already conditioned to think in terms of German aggression. A missing Navy ship needed no supernatural explanation when there was an active enemy operating in the same waters. Naval investigators pursued the theory seriously. The German Navy maintained detailed records of U-boat operations, including patrol zones, attack reports, and confirmed sinkings. These records were examined both during and after the war. When German naval archives became accessible to Allied investigators following Germany's defeat in November 1918, the search through those records produced nothing. Not a single U-boat log recorded an attack in the location or time frame consistent with the Cyclops' final route. No German submarine commander filed a report of sinking a vessel matching the Cyclops' description during that period. No German naval record of any kind connected to the disappearance of the ship was found. This absence is significant. German U-boat commanders were meticulous record keepers. Confirmed sinkings were documented, reported, and in many cases celebrated within the German naval command structure. A vessel of the Cyclops' size would have been a notable kill. If a U-boat had sunk her, that record would almost certainly exist. It does not. Beyond the documentary absence, there is also the physical evidence to consider. Torpedo attacks leave traces. A torpedo strike ruptures a hull explosively, producing debris fields, oil slicks, and in many cases bodies that surface in the hours and days following an attack. The search of the Atlantic found none of these indicators. No torpedo fragments, no explosion characteristic wreckage patterns, nothing that pointed to a violent external strike as the cause of the sinking. Investigators also examined the possibility of sabotage from within. The theory that German agents or sympathizers aboard the ship had deliberately caused her destruction. Captain Worley's German birth became part of this narrative. His reported erratic behavior was reframed by some as suspicious rather than simply unstable. Theories circulated that Worley had intentionally sailed the ship into danger or had allowed saboteurs to compromise her. These theories found no evidentiary support. Worley had served in the United States Navy for years without any confirmed act of disloyalty. His behavior, while unusual, was consistent with accounts that described him as a difficult and temperamental commander rather than a traitor. No evidence of sabotage, internal or external, was ever discovered. The U-boat theory and the sabotage theory, despite their initial appeal, collapsed under the weight of what was not found. The war provided a convenient villain, but the evidence refused to cooperate. The answer to what happened to the Cyclops was not in the wartime context that surrounded her disappearance. It was in the ship itself. The war ended in November 1918. The years passed. The investigation into the Cyclops faded from active naval inquiry into historical record. The case remained officially unsolved, and that official uncertainty created a space that popular culture would eventually fill with something far more dramatic than structural failure or cargo shift. In the decades following the Second World War, a new mythology began to take shape around a specific region of the Western Atlantic Ocean. The area roughly bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico was gradually constructed in the popular imagination as a zone of inexplicable danger. Ships and aircraft that had been lost in or near this region over the years were grouped together and presented as evidence of a pattern that defied rational explanation. The term Bermuda Triangle entered public consciousness in the early 1960s and reached its peak cultural saturation in the 1970s, driven by books, magazine articles, and television programs that presented the disappearances within the region as proof of something genuinely anomalous. Theories ranged from unusual magnetic fields that interfered with navigation instruments to underwater geological formations that produced catastrophic methane releases. Others went further, suggesting the involvement of extraterrestrial activity, underwater alien bases, or dimensional portals that swallowed ships and aircraft whole. The USS Cyclops was a natural centerpiece for this narrative. She was large, she was fully crewed, she had disappeared without a trace, and her final route passed through waters that fell within the boundaries of the newly defined triangle. She became one of the most frequently cited cases in Bermuda Triangle literature, repeated across dozens of books and countless television documentaries as definitive proof that something extraordinary was operating in that region of the ocean. But the Bermuda Triangle as a concept does not hold up to systematic scrutiny. Researchers who examined the statistical basis of the triangle found that the region does not produce a measurably higher rate of ship or aircraft disappearances than any other heavily traveled stretch of ocean in the world. The cases grouped under the triangle label often involved vessels that disappeared far outside the defined boundaries, or losses that had perfectly documented conventional explanations that were simply omitted from the popular narrative. Insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London, who track maritime losses globally with financial precision, found no basis for treating the Bermuda Triangle as a statistically anomalous zone of risk. The Cyclops' inclusion in the Bermuda Triangle mythology obscured something important. The actual explanation for her disappearance, the overloaded hull, the shifting cargo, the malfunctioning engine, the brutal March Atlantic, was not mysterious. It was mechanical. It was human. It was the result of decisions made by people operating under wartime pressure with inadequate safety margins. By placing the Cyclops inside a supernatural framework, popular culture made it easier to not ask the harder questions. Questions about why a ship was allowed to depart overloaded. Questions about why a commander with reported behavioral concerns was left in charge of 309 lives. Questions about the institutional pressures of wartime that pushed systems and people past the point of safe operation. The legend was more comfortable than the truth. And, for decades, the legend won. More than a century has passed since the USS Cyclops sailed out of Barbados and into permanent silence. In the decades following her disappearance, the case was periodically revisited by naval historians, maritime engineers, and investigative researchers. Each serious examination of the available evidence arrived at conclusions that, while not producing absolute certainty, pointed consistently in the same direction. The United States Navy's official position has never changed. The cause of the loss of the USS Cyclops is listed as unknown. That official designation reflects the absence of physical evidence. No wreck, no confirmed debris, no surviving witnesses. In the formal language of naval record-keeping, unknown is the only honest answer when the evidence required for a definitive conclusion does not exist. But unknown does not mean inexplicable. In 2014, a research team examining historical naval records reported findings that added a significant new dimension to the technical understanding of the Cyclops' vulnerability. The ship's hull design, a product of early 20th century naval engineering, had structural characteristics that made her particularly susceptible to the kind of stress produced by an overloaded cargo of dense ore. Under the combined forces of heavy seas and internal cargo movement, the hull could have experienced catastrophic failure. Not just capsizing, but an actual structural break, the ship splitting apart under forces that exceeded what her frame was engineered to bear. A vessel that breaks apart rather than simply capsizes produces a very different kind of debris field. Depending on the speed and nature of the structural failure, heavy components sink immediately and directly, rather than drifting with the current. A ship that goes down fast and in pieces, in deep water far from established shipping lanes, may produce surface debris so dispersed and so quickly submerged that a 1918-era search effort would find nothing at all. This scenario is consistent with every aspect of what the investigation did and did not find. No distress signal. The ship went down too fast for any transmission to be made. No wreckage. The debris either sank immediately or dispersed beyond the search area before the Navy began looking. No bodies in a rapid sinking in deep open ocean. The recovery of human remains is the exception, not the rule. No confirmed location. The Cyclops' exact position between Barbados and Baltimore was never precisely established, leaving a search zone of hundreds of square miles of deep Atlantic water. Everything that is absent is consistent with a rapid, catastrophic sinking. Everything that is known about the ship's condition makes that kind of sinking not only possible, but, in the assessment of naval engineers and maritime historians who have studied the case seriously, probable. The mystery of the USS Cyclops was never truly a mystery of the ocean. The ocean did what oceans do to ships that are pushed beyond what they can safely bear. The real mystery, if it can be called that, is human. It is the question of how 309 people came to be placed on a vessel in that condition, in those waters, under those circumstances, with no realistic margin for survival if anything went wrong. The answer to that question sits in the decision-making structures of a nation at war. A nation under pressure. A nation moving strategic materials at maximum speed, with maximum loads, across an unforgiving ocean. Because the war demanded it, and because the cost of delay felt, in that moment, greater than the risk of overloading a ship, that calculation was wrong. The cost was 309 lives. The USS Cyclops rests somewhere on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. The exact location has never been confirmed. No memorial marks the site. No coordinates define the place where she finally came to rest. She is simply down there in the dark and the cold, carrying the weight of a cargo that was always too heavy, and a story that the ocean has never fully agreed to release.